All right, let's move on to the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, which wrapped up a few weeks ago, but I wanted to give a little time to get my thoughts together. And of course, we delayed this episode a few days, so it's a little later than I wanted it to. But I want to start with my thoughts on watching the trial itself. So, first, I wanted to say how heart wrenching it was to see him break down on the stand as he was testifying on what happened that day. And you could tell Kyle was not only fighting for his life on the witness stand during the trial, but in turn was recalling that night he was also fighting for his life, leading him to pull the trigger. And as a son, and someone who kind of could put myself in his shoes a little bit because I'm not too much older than him, I don't even want to think about how he and his mom and dad are handling this, but I can imagine there are big hugs and lots of emotion now that he is quote unquote free. But I thought good for him for calming down and being able to finish testifying. I thought that was pretty brave of him to do it and to basically fight for his life. But then we saw Kyle's reaction after finding out he was not guilty. I think was a natural reaction for someone who has seen their life flash before their eyes multiple times and within a year basically, and probably was preparing for the worst. And once it was clear the worst wasn't going to happen and wasn't going to become a reality, clearly this was a motion of relief, but he got it together even quicker than the time before compared to when he was on the stand. And you could tell his mind took a second to process the not guilty. So I thought that was wild to witness. But now onto my thoughts on the outcome and the response to the whole trial. But no matter what leading up to this moment happened or what happened after the moment where he shot and killed two guys, whether he should have gone there to Kenosha or not, he did not deserve to be shot at and clearly defended himself. And as Geraldo Rivera, who's on Fox News and his own interesting person, he says something I sort of agree with, in that Kyle seems to have this kind of hero complex, or at least a desire to protect and serve his community, which is probably the source of what led him to be in Kenosha that week to kind of protect the business and protect the community. And that drive can also have been used, well, can be used now for more good in society now that we know he won't be spending life in jail. Whereas if he had been convicted, that desire to help his community would have been basically ended right there. So to those who were saying he shouldn't have been there, and if he hadn't shown up, this would not have happened, as kind of their case against Kyle for whatever their bias or their reason for not liking him is, I would like to point out how that is the same argument often shut down in other cases like rape, where we say just because they were there doesn't mean they deserve to be treated a certain way. And we can say, sure, yeah, they made decisions leading up to that moment that may not have been the best. We still don't think that they deserve to be raped, or in this case, shot or attacked, just because they were there with good intentions and then it turned south and turned bad really quickly. And also, the same people that were kind of advocating against what they're calling Kyle as this vigilante policing, or whatever they want to call it, which this has become a self-defense policing law enforcement related case, are the same ones supporting the Biden administration greenlighting basically to businesses and forcing a vaccine mandate basically as healthcare vigilantes, despite the courts stalling the government from doing so. So I thought it was an interesting point where consistency is lacking from some covering this story. It also makes me think, even though some see this as a win for self-defense, some will also use this to reverse kind of the defund the police rhetoric in favor of more policing, to move towards more of a police state while taking advantage of the kind of back the blue movement, which already has support of policing. And this and other things were kind of maybe baits and switches to get everyone on one side in favor of more policing. So that was one theory I thought. But on a similar note, I saw Dan Bongino, who is kind of a conservative, he calls himself a conservatarian, I think. I tend to agree with him on a lot of things, but I saw him saying that the prosecutor in this case shows how the system is broken. And when I heard that, I thought it was kind of a checkmate for what I'm calling the enemies within, who have been saying this, kind of like the system is racist and broken and whatnot, and kind of we need to overhaul and revolutionize the system. Because I think the prosecutor, but I should say, but I think the prosecutor not getting away with charging someone who maybe shouldn't have been charged, meaning the jury actually found them not guilty, kind of, and this prosecutor was put on blast on live TV about all the flaws and kind of how maybe he shouldn't have brought the case up, and maybe knowing he messed up, to me means the system is working, because it is pushing it back against the corrupt and incompetent by a defense pointing out and motioning on the misconduct, and a jury still getting to decide with a judge in a court, despite all the pressure, that although the system, that this guy was not guilty, even though some would say he shouldn't even been charged. But of course we can say that the system could be more perfect, but we're always attempting to be a more perfect union, so it's never going to be perfect. We always are striving for the next thing. But all that means that the system is still standing, although it has been strained and tested and bruised very, very much recently. So just wanted to put that in there. But one thing I also saw too was about the prosecutor. One of his arguments against Kyle Rittenhouse was saying basically, well, the guy was only pointing a gun at you, Kyle, and hadn't shot at you first, and that's the reason that you shouldn't have shot him, and that you weren't justified in shooting him first. And so I thought to myself, well, would you rather have the guy shoot and kill Kyle first with malicious intent to hurt him, and charge the other guy for and not saying he wasn't in self-defense, or not charge him maybe, I don't know. Because if it is based on the principle of self-defense, then interchanging characters in the situation shouldn't change the situation. And I know this is kind of controversial, but now knowing the backgrounds of the four men involved, if I had to choose who lives and who doesn't in that situation, I'm choosing Kyle to live over the other guys. Now you can agree or disagree in the comments, whatever you want, but let's keep going. So also, there was the idea from the prosecutor that a foot or a skateboard can't be used as a deadly weapon, and he was trying to say that Kyle just wasn't justified in shooting those guys because they only had a skateboard and their bodies and an unloaded gun, which I don't think he knew it was unloaded at the time, because how do you know unless you are the owner of the gun? Well, we don't have to look much further back than the George Floyd situation last year, where that was framed as a police officer using their knee as deadly force. I'll go back to that trial a little bit later when I compare and contrast this with that. But I don't see how you can say a knee is deadly force, but bashing someone over the head with a skateboard or kicking them isn't. So I thought that point fell a little flat. But the lesson also I learned in watching the prosecution and defense and the judge for that reason is for us to kind of to strive to be better students and better prepared, especially for myself. I took this away as someone who works within a legal framework in my career. Now, whether it be the judge questioning if he should allow cameras in courtrooms ever again of his trials, or the prosecution attempting to infringe on constitutional rights of a witness or a defendant, or the defense not picking up on the video evidence being admitted that shouldn't have been admitted because of theirs, and the judge's ignorance on that technology. I think these are all lessons we can learn. But another jarring moment was when the prosecutor seemed to point the assumed unloaded gun at something. Some were saying it was the jury, and he had the finger on the trigger. And it was just interesting to see, because of the timing of this Rust movie set shooting with Alec Baldwin that we just talked about, how this was eerily similar. And it was kind of a question of, did we not learn anything from that? But maybe he wanted the jury to be intimidated by a gun pointing at them to prove his point on how dangerous Kyle pointing a gun was. But it could also work the other way in proving that the guy pointing the gun at Kyle provoked Kyle to shoot first justifiably. So I thought that was an interesting point. Not sure what he was thinking there. But let's continue on with more thoughts on the outcome and the response to the trial. So, first, I wanted to say that the judge questioning whether he should have allowed cameras in the courtroom and ever would again is something I hope he doesn't change, because we don't want justice to be in the darkness. But also, the problem too with these televised trials is we are seeing basically everything going on in the courtroom, even stuff that, even stuff the jury isn't seeing. So when a verdict comes in, we have to take that into account and accept that there may be discrepancies between what we're seeing and what the jury is seeing, and maybe a reason for a possible different outcome than we think as viewers not in the courtroom. And on that same note, also, it shouldn't be all or nothing regarding, in my opinion, regarding televised trials, because a high profile case is something I think we want to see and have access to uphold the integrity of the system and see firsthand the good and the bad. The problem too, though, is the potential for the subjects portrayed in the trial in front of the camera being turned into these sensationalized figures by special interests. And so the answer to that, I don't think, is not hiding things in the dark. And to that, I also think that we have examples of documentaries and shows where a light is shown on cold cases that get new life, then get solved after years of being in the dark. So we have to kind of accept the good and the bad of this choice of kind of televising these events. Now, speaking of being able to see firsthand the good and the bad via televised trial, the good thing is it didn't matter how fumbled the prosecutor was, or how bad they did, or how evil they seemed, or how many mistakes the defense made for Kyle, or how many mistakes the judge made, or any of the intimidation from outside the courthouse for a non-sequestered jury. It still came down to 12 people in a jury who are Kyle's peers in Kenosha, Wisconsin, or in Wisconsin. And even though I personally was growing impatient for the verdict to come in, because I knew if the verdict came in after that Thursday of that week, I'd have to wait another week plus to share my thoughts, I would much rather wait to share if it means the jury is taking their time and being thorough on their verdict to get it right. And also, according to Kyle's lawyer, the controversial jury pick from a box thing that court does, where out of the possible 18 jurors, they pick 12 that Kyle picked with his hand. He said, the lawyer actually said, and ended up being that their top 3 jurors who seemed to be supporting their side were not picked. So you can make of that statement whatever you want, but we will have to see kind of how all these factors I just mentioned affected the jury in any way in their decision, when or if they ever decide to speak out. Now, on the media front, it did seem like there were more media outside the courthouse than protesters for most of the trial, and mostly after as well. And another interesting thing I thought was how schools that in that area, in preparation for any unrest after the verdict came through, they went to remote learning for that week. And I thought to myself, that may be one of the interesting benefits, side effects of the pandemic, where remote work and remote learning became a viable option. And maybe this is something to stay and stick around for these emergency situations, such as civil unrest or weather incidents. Maybe instead of having a snow day where you don't learn, you take your learning home. And it can be kind of adjusted on the fly. And those instances where it's safer to stay home and not be at a physical school. But then again, we are learning that should be used sparingly and not necessarily be the default for other mental health and developmental reasons with children. So now on to Kyle's interview with Tucker Carlson. So I thought it was interesting to hear Kyle confirm how he went back across state lines to turn himself in, because the Kenosha police station was barricaded, and he said he went out of his way to turn himself in. That, to me, does not support someone who had ill intentions. And he said his mom actually said to not advocated for him to not turn himself in and they should go into hiding. But he also thought it was the right thing to do because he knew he didn't do anything wrong. So to me, that indicated the character of Kyle, and it wasn't matching what a lot of people were trying to paint him as in the media. Now, also in this interview, he said that he actually supports the peaceful Black Lives Matter movement to peacefully protest, but not to burn and loot. Which, if you're watching some coverage of the trial and accounts of who Kyle is, that would surprise you, because they are trying to paint this trial as kind of a racial angle via Kyle, when really the protests Kyle was at were sparked by the Jacob Blake shooting in that community by police officers. So it's interesting to see that that interview kind of blew up the whole media narrative that was trying to be pushed onto Kyle. Now, on that same front, Kyle did say that the prosecutorial misconduct he saw play out in front of him in his trial, he thinks is a systemic problem affecting people of all walks of life. And I continue to say that making the problem with the system all about race and how insane it only affects Black people or other minorities works against everyone, because clearly he had some misconduct against him, and the jury saw through that basically. But because in order to have minorities not be adversely affected by the system, it needs to be addressed based on a principle level, regardless of race or other identities that someone has. That's how we get rid of it. So Kyle then said he thought if a person of color was in his position, he thought that it might have turned out differently, meaning he might have been convicted or called guilty. Now, I'm not sure if he meant the jury would have decided he was guilty, or that the media narrative would have been defending him instead of painting him as kind of this white supremacist, whatever that they're trying to do. But my last note on the interview from Kyle with Tucker, I found interesting was Kyle respectfully but passive aggressively responded to President Biden, basically calling him a white supremacist last year when he was still a candidate for president, saying that he hopes the president watches the trial back and sees the facts. Now, President Biden hasn't really apologized or backtracked on his comments. He basically said, I support the jury, what they decided. But what I would like to see from President Joe Biden, but I'm not holding my breath, is, and I think this would go a long way with a lot of people, is if he truly believes in healing the nation and bringing people together, maybe invite Kyle and his family to the White House and apologize in person, and come from a place of being a parent of a son who wanted to serve his community. And from my understanding, he lost his life in the line of duty. But of course, I don't think that's going to happen, because I know Kyle has actually went to Mar-a-Lago and visited President Trump, and I believe was welcomed to Florida by the Florida governor. So I have a feeling that's not going to happen. But then again, also by President Biden doing that, it would draw attention to his checkered past on race, and probably he would rather stick to accusing others of things to deflect from his own issues. But anyways, I digress on that point. But as far as Kyle's future goes, Kyle is now someone who the media and others and other interests have tried to kind of end or cancel or silence. And now that he is quote unquote free, he is also now more knowledgeable and experienced in the legal system than before, and empowered to go into that field and help kind of correct the system, or at least approach it from a fair and legal stance. And I can imagine many people don't really want this guy empowered to use the system the right way, or when, let's say in the future, he does something that they agree with along the kind of criminal justice reform, they'll have to either eat their own words on the smears of him that they've done up to this point, or just be silent and kind of risk being hypocrites or whatnot. But his lawyer did talk with Martha McCallum, and it sounded like the lawyer is advising Kyle to kind of change his name and go into a more private life, and not to buy into those trying to take advantage of him to create this kind of symbol of whatever agenda they're trying to push. So we will see if we ever hear from Kyle Rittenhouse as Kyle Rittenhouse ever again in the future. But finally, I wanted to give some brief comments and compare and contrast some other recent high-profile cases to this one, which I already alluded to some earlier. But the recent Ahmaud Arbery case in Georgia, which was another self-defense case, I watched some of that testimony. I didn't follow that one as closely as the Kyle Rittenhouse, but I watched the men charged with the murder testify, and I got almost the opposite feeling I did when I saw Kyle testifying, where in the Ahmaud Arbery case, the defendant seemed very cold, not very remorseful, and we were kind of waiting for information to come out that would lean towards a justification of at least following Ahmaud and like trying to catch him. But nothing really came out to really justify any of that, and obviously not self-defense at all. And so I was happy that that verdict came out the way it did. Now, in reference back to the Derek Chauvin trial in the death of George Floyd, at the time I accepted the verdict in that case, even though as I watched, I had doubts of any direct connection between what Derek's knee directly caused George's death. But I accepted the verdict. I was like, okay, that's what it is. But in that case, there seemed to be a little bit more gray area versus the Kyle Rittenhouse case. But in the Rittenhouse case, the jury took days of deliberation to come to a verdict, whereas the Chauvin jury just took hours. So I wonder, it's interesting to see how different juries in different states across the country reacted to their trial and different events, and how we saw it play out live. And I wonder how any of this affected what was going on. So we will see. Those are all my thoughts. So let me know what you thought of that whole trial and kind of my thoughts on it. And if you agree, disagree, let me know wherever you are tuning in from, wherever you are able to comment.